You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
What kind of hymns would Lutherans have been singing in Germany before they came to America? Well, today we're going to continue our conversation with musicologist Benjamin Kolodziej as we continue our series on his book, Portraits in American Lutheran Sacred Music. I am enjoying this book thoroughly. Can't wait to dig into it more with him in just a moment. Today's episode of The Coffee Hour is underwritten in part by Concordia University Irvine. You can learn more about Concordia University Irvine by visiting cui.edu. Joining us today, Benjamin Kolodziej, church organist and musicologist, author of Portraits in American Lutheran Sacred Music, 1847 to 1947, from Concordia Publishing House. Benjamin, welcome back to The Coffee Hour.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right. So today we get to dig into another topic in your book, and you helped us organize the topics for these interviews. We didn't break it up chapter by chapter, but rather topic by topic. So if you want to know what's in the book, you actually have to read the book. The series isn't giving it all away.
Nope.
But it's got me so interested. I'm enjoying reading the book. So the opening question today that I just gave a minute ago, what kinds of hymns would Lutherans have been singing in Germany before they came to America? What do you know about that?
Well, I think that leads us well into why the Lutherans came to America in the first place, because Lutherans had this great tradition of chorale singing. We know them. We know the German chorales in our hymnals, from Gerhard, from Luther, Spiratus. And in the early 19th century, the Prussian Union said, at least in Prussia, that the Lutherans and the Reformed had to sing the same sort of hymns. They couldn't be too Lutheran. They couldn't be too Reformed. Of course, the Lutherans usually got the short end of the deal here because their doctrine, their hymns were rather shorn of doctrine. And that was one of the motivations for immigrating to America. They wanted to be able to sing the hymns that they knew, and in particular, what's called the old hymnals, the old Saxon, the old Dresden hymnal, which was a very specific one that had the Orthodox hymns that they were no longer allowed to sing. And that motivated them to come to America so that they could not only worship freely, but to sing what they wanted to sing. And they wanted to sing the older chorales, unencumbered, I should say, with rationalist or pietist tendencies, focused on the gospel, many of which we can still sing from LSB. That was their motivation, and it really motivated C.F.W. Walther when he created the first hymnal.
And we'll get to that hymnal in just a bit, because I know there's a lot of circumstance surrounding that influences how people were singing at that time. But you mentioned rationalism, and this is a fairly important cultural influence on hymn singing at this time, if I'm understanding it correctly. What was this influence of rationalism on hymn singing in general at this time?
At its worst, rationalism downplayed anything miraculous. The miracles, aspects of the church that focused on Christ and his life. So the liturgical year was downplayed in favor of topics. So your hymnal indexes in rationalist times would generally be arranged by topics rather than liturgical year, because it was seen that hymns must be supremely practical, not necessarily devotional, certainly not didactic. And this is very different than what Luther conceived in his hymnody. They should teach, you should sing your doctrine, you should do it enthusiastically, which later really motivated C.F.W. Walther to say, we need to sing these hymns like we mean them, because this is doctrine that we're singing. So the rationalists were not concerned with doctrine. They downplayed that whenever they could. And that was a problem for the conservative Orthodox Lutherans that lived in Saxony and Prussia in particular.
Rationalism, what a fun topic. So what were Walther's opinions on this singing style that came out of rationalism?
Well, maybe we should just review a little bit about what happened when the immigrants got to St. Louis, because they got there 1839, 1840. They had established a church, Trinity, and already back in 1843, this is 3 years or so after they landed, the voters resolved that they would only sing pure Lutheran hymns in their services. Well, of course, what does this mean? This goes back to our question. It's like, well, they were going to sing older hymns that had not been modified by the rationalist writers, and they were going to use fewer rationalist hymns. But when the immigrants came, they had all manner of hymnals. There's, who knows, 5 or 6 different hymnals floating around, and that presented a problem. But the idea was they were only going to sing pure Lutheran hymnody. And I should say a choir was established about this time, 1843. We know this because at the very fun Concordia Historical Institute there in St. Louis, they have on a microfilm voters' meetings from the voters' meeting minutes from Trinity St. Louis, which are rather hard to read because they're written in old script, but they're a lot of fun. If you don't know, churches in the olden days had voters' meetings like every week after church. They had to vote on everything, which must have been quite a pain for the pastors and everybody, really. But it's great for the historians because we can find out all manner of little topics that in later years churches wouldn't bother writing down. So we know lots of things from the early Trinity. We know from the minutes that a choir was established in 1843 because 3 benches were being reserved for them. And before that, they had relied on somebody who would just kind of lead the singing with their hands in front, possibly with a pump organ, probably with a violin. Remember, violin was very important in the early Lutheran Church in the 19th century. They probably had a pump organ too. We don't really know. But then the choir replaced them. So it was in 1845 that C.F.W. Walther says, well, if we're going to sing good Lutheran Orthodox hymns, we need to have one unified hymnal from which we can all sing. And that is ultimately what happened in 1847.
All right. So what were Walther's opinions on the style of singing that was happening during this time?
Right. So I'd like to read from what Carl Schock, he was a great musicologist and composer at Concordia, Chicago for decades. He wrote something, the description of how hymns were sung before and during Walther's time, and what Walther really hated this manner of singing. But I'm going to read from what Carl Schock says. He says, quote, each syllable was sung without distinction for a period of about 4 beats. On the last syllable of each line of a hymn, or at the end of the melodic phrase, there would follow a long fermata lasting 8 to 12 beats, the last part of which is incorporated in a more or less intricate organ interlude. So all the melodies follow one line after the other in this repetitious manner. Whether sad or joyous, mournful or exultant, all hymns were performed in a creeping, dragging fashion. The hymns of Luther have had their wings clipped and have put on the straitjacket of 4/4 time. And so it came about that the more inflexible singing of the chorale was, the more solemn it was thought to be. And unquote. And elsewhere, we know that 1 beat was a quarter note equals 60. It doesn't matter how I know this. It's from reading too many Schulblatts in the 19th century. 1 quarter note. So if you think of a mighty fortress, a mighty fortress is our God, then that would hold, and the organ would play an interlude, which I can't hum, but you have to just imagine that. Then the congregation would continue. Well, you can imagine how lugubrious this was. And Walther himself, he said, we need to go back to the original melodies, the old melodies. And he wrote in Der Lutheraner and other places, he promoted rhythmic singing. So when I talk about rhythmic singing, that's opposed to isometric. So isometric is when, as the tunes came down to us, they were kind of straightened out. Instead of the rhythmic, a mighty fortress is our God. Even by Bach's time, we had mighty fortress is our God. We had two ways of singing, perfectly legitimate and fine. But Walther preferred the rhythmic way of singing, and he promoted that through his entire life. He said a few things, and in Der Lutheraner in particular, and he justified this because Lutherans then were probably no more in favor of change than are Lutherans now. And Walther was pastoral enough to know, hey, people aren't going to like these changes. So he wrote some justifications. I'm going to read from a few I have in my book. I'm sure there's more elsewhere, but he wrote, "Whoever has heard the old melodies and the new melodies sung side by side will certainly prefer the old ones." He also says, "What is more beautiful and better, a work of art as the master originally created it, or that work of art as it comes through incompetent bunglers and butchers who mess it up later?" Walther was a bit maybe like Luther. He was very direct and to the point. He also says, "We sing one note as long as the other. This was not originally the case with all melodies. Rather, as one does not speak all syllables of the same length when speaking, but one longer, the other shorter, so it is in many melodies. They often have longer and shorter notes, which alternate among themselves. These new versions have taken away all the freshness, all the life, and all the movement from these melodies. You wouldn't sing a secular song like that. It sounds lame and boring. So why in the church should what is miserable suddenly become beautiful and dignified?" So he really wants us to sing faster. He wants us to sing the words with the original melodies, which he thought, and I personally agree with, the original melodies convey the text better with the accents. He thought we could do that better, and it would give us some more interest. He also says, um, of what had come to be their style of singing, he says, quote, "We too often make no distinction between joyful and sad melodies, between a song of thanksgiving and a chorale of penitence, between an Easter song and a Christmas song, singing everything in the same slow and boring way, one after the other. How nonsensical! The joyful wants to be sung faster, the serious and sad wants to be sung slower." This is just some of the ways that Walther thought we should approach hymn singing.
Fascinating opinions. This is, now I'm just curious, this isn't necessarily, I don't think, a topic in the book, but what was going on in church music and other traditions at this time? And this is solely out of my own curiosity.
I mean, it plays a part.
But yeah, what was happening in church music and other traditions? Lutherans are dealing with this rationalism and pietism too, right? So what's going on in other church bodies and their church music at this time as well? Would that have influenced where Lutherans were in church music?
To answer that question, the last part of it, I think, is the salient one. Did it influence Lutheran hymnody? I don't think it did. So let me take, for example, in the 1830s, the Anglican Church underwent the Oxford movement, where they suddenly discovered these great Latin hymns, medieval hymns, that they were, Catherine Winkworth was translating these. So you had a revival in the 1830s in England, but that didn't really translate in any meaningful way to the LCMS. And of course, you get to America, and the Lutherans are confronted with the Methodists and the Baptists who have their own style of singing. They have spirituals, well, in their own way at the time, but just a totally different ways, and they're singing English. So there was really no interaction, and Walther was very careful to preserve the liturgy and his hymnody in German, so that his congregations did not adapt into English. He just wanted to preserve it. So it's a great question, and you would think that there would be some influence, but at this point, there really wasn't. That influence would come, I think, arguably in the later 19th century, say the 1880s, with the Common Service, and Lutherans finally realized, hey, we've got to adapt in some ways. We've got to adapt certainly to English. So how are we going to do that?
It wasn't until the change to English probably that there was great influence. That makes sense. And speaking of making sense, we're going to make more sense of history in just a moment as we continue our conversation with Benjamin Kolodziej, author of Portraits in American Lutheran Sacred Music, right here on the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
The Concordia University system is comprised of 5 universities of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Located across the United States, the universities offer more than 160 undergraduate and 50 graduate programs and approach learning from a Lutheran context with the goal of developing Christian leaders for the church, community, and the world. Learn more about your Concordia University system at cus.edu. The Concordia University System. Education built on God's Word. cus.edu.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
Today we're continuing our series in American Portraits, our Portraits in American Lutheran Sacred Music with Benjamin Kolodziej, church organist and musicologist. I'm having a great time digging into church music history, and this is just fascinating. Lutherans immigrating to the United States and what was happening in hymnody at that time, particularly looking at Walther's shaping of American Lutheran hymnody and wanting pure Lutheran hymns. So why was this change into more rhythmic singing, rhythmic hymns, important to Walther and the Lutherans in America at that time? Why was this so important?
Well, Walther believed that the rhythmic singing conveyed the text better and thus conveyed theology better. It was all about teaching for him. In fact, as a musician, musicians sometimes would make different hymn choices, say, than pastors. Pastors are often thinking solely about the text. I'm exaggerating here. I know that's not always the case, but they are oriented on the text. And in many cases, musicians, they think about the melody. And a good pastor and a good musician, or a good musician, thinks about both. And I really get the sense, even though Walther was a great musician, he was an organist, pianist, he really thought first about the text. How are the texts going to communicate the gospel, the long gospel, the catechism, to his congregation? And he believed strongly that they would do that through the rhythmic chorale. And in fact, he had to teach it. And so in 1849, Walther initiated what's called Singstunde, or singing hours, in which he taught these rhythmic chorales. And so there were, I think, Thursday and Friday evenings at Emmanuel and Trinity downtown. So they gathered the congregation. Can you imagine this? I mean, imagine gathering your congregation during the week for an hour just to learn and to sing hymns. But that's how important it was to him. He was successful in doing so. And of course, he ended up publishing it, although it wasn't solely Walther, it was mostly him, the Kirchengesangbuch, the first hymnal of the LCMS in 1847, which collected these Orthodox Lutheran texts from the old hymnals from Saxony. And he in 1862, they actually Trinity gifted the congregation the hymnal to the Missouri Synod before it had just been a project of the church. But it was seen that, well, if you're going to be a Lutheran, you should sing these hymns. You should sing them the right way. You should sing the right text. You should sing Luther. And Walther was greatly influential in doing so. And I think you can see that even to this day in LSB. If you look at LSB, how many German hymns are in there? If you look in the index in the back, kind of hard to, you don't really get nationalities. There's no nationality index, but you can kind of tell. There's a lot of German chorales. Whereas you look at hymnals of other denominations, you won't have that high percentage of German hymns. You'll have many others, Swedish, Danish, Scandinavian, and the like, or American. But I think Walther ensured that it's through Walther's influence that we have so many of these German hymns in LSB.
Do you have that hymnal from 1847?
I have the 1862 version because there was a lot of them. I do not have the 1847, and I'm feeling very sad about it at all times, and particularly now. I wish I did. But this hymnal was published well into the 20th century, even past the point where most Missouri Synod churches were singing in English. This was such a popular book. It had the same cover little design, and it was just a very influential book. I wish I had it.
I'm wondering if I have a version of that on my hymn shelf at home. I'm going to have to go look when I go home later and see. I don't know. So how were organs and choirs involved in this congregational singing at this time? We've got the hymn book, we've got the 3 pews reserved for the choir. How did all of that work together?
Right. Walther was an advocate of unison congregational singing. So, whereas in LSB we have 2 staves of music on most hymns, so we have a soprano, alto, tenor, bass, you can sing parts. Walther advocated that you only sing unison. And his hymnal, of course, didn't have music. At the time, hymnals only contained the text of the hymns. So he wanted you to sing unison. He wanted you to sing with enthusiasm. And that's how choirs were involved. They did not originally sing anthems, like oftentimes we have the Psalm, we have the Old Testament, and then we perhaps stop and we have the choral anthem. And then we continue with the readings. That was not how it was. If a choir was involved at all, and they really weren't particularly important until the later 19th century, they would sing hymn verses, lead the hymn singing, lead the liturgy. And we know this from other sources too, but there's a Schulblatt article from 1866 in which one of the professors at Addison tells the organist how to prepare for the service and never mentions the choir. So the choir really, when it existed, was an extension of the congregation. I think that's also a good lesson for today. But Walther was instrumental not only in getting got a pipe organ at Trinity in the 1840s, and got another one in 1858, if I recall. You might have to check my book. I think that's the date. And then Trinity built a brand new church sanctuary, which is the one that currently stands, in 1865. And the 1858 organ was given to St. Salvador Church in Hymnody, Illinois, right across the river. And so Walther had this chance to design this great big pipe organ for Trinity downtown. And that's exactly what he did. And he probably designed it. We don't know this. Walther lots of times didn't take credit for things, but there is an article in the Schulblatt which reports about this new instrument that was built in 1865 for the new building. It says, quote, "This organ, without doubt, the largest in the churches of the Missouri Synod, and possibly even the largest of all the Lutheran churches in this country, deserves the special attention of all of the friends of the pipe organ." And he goes on, unquote, and he goes on to talk about the stops and how it sounds. It was a huge instrument. And in fact, Missouri Synod churches would oftentimes model their subsequent organs on that one because they wanted to have organ like Walther had at Trinity. In fact, even here in Texas, which was never really connected to Missouri in many significant ways, the first pipe organ in an LCMS church was in Warda, Texas, which I was just this past week. I was there, and it was built by the same builder. Pfeffer was his name, who built the organ at Trinity St. Louis. And it was said, this is a quote, I didn't come up with this myself. It was said, quote, "A St. Louis pastor in the pulpit and a Pfeffer organ in the gallery was the test of sound Lutheranism," unquote. So you had to have this builder. If you're a Missouri Synod, you had to have this builder who ironically was Catholic. He wasn't even Lutheran. Build your organ for you.
So how did this style of singing spread beyond the congregations Walther served in the St. Louis area? How did this style of rhythmic singing move beyond here?
Well, we talked about in a previous episode how important the Addison Seminary was for teaching. And the Addison Seminary professors, which weren't numerous at first, only 3 or 4, 5 and 6 through the 1860s, the first music professor, Karl Brauer, he taught his students the rhythmic way of singing. He wrote about it. So even when his students graduated, they were still reminded and nagged by their organ professor, their church music professor, you need to sing this way. And of course, the publication of the hymnal was very important. Now, I talked about the hymnal not having music. So that's a detriment because it's possible for you to go out in your congregation and sing different melodies. But there were hymnal accompaniment books eventually. Like I mentioned with Karl Brauer, he published one 1880s that had the rhythmic chorale version, so that all these Lutherans. There's another one, Heinrich Helter from St. Louis. He published another one. They had used European books before. And so it was, you just couldn't buy accompaniment books. You couldn't buy music just online from Amazon or wherever now. You'd have to go to Chicago. You'd have to order it from, or go to St. Louis, someplace like that. So it was hard to get unified congregational singing, but eventually they really did that. And I think it's a tribute to Walther setting the leadership, but to the Addison Seminary professors teaching their students in a faithful way that this is important, and continuing as they published articles about reminding them how important this was.
Now, you mentioned the German hymns and LSB. Is there any other place we see, or other examples in our Lutheran service book of where a lot of this legacy, where we see this legacy today of all the things that Walther cared about in the late 1800s?
Well, I think you can see in the arrangement of the hymnal. We started off talking about rationalism. And one of the characteristics of rationalist hymnody or hymnals was that it quite downplayed the importance of the liturgical year. It did this because the liturgical year reflects the life of Christ, doesn't it? You can't have the liturgical year without Christ. And if you're going to say Christ really wasn't God, or these miracles in the Bible didn't really happen, well, you don't need the liturgy. You just need hymns to sing hymns that are moralistic, sort of. And you can look in LSB and you see how many of the hymns are devoted to Christ's life, the liturgical year, or to Christ's life. And then, like I mentioned, how many are German. I think that's definitely a result of Walther's continuing to promote these old Lutheran hymnals, the pre-rationalist hymnals, because they always point to Christ. And LSB, in very practical ways, even removed from the hymn text, just the way it's arranged, the importance of the liturgical year, the subject categories, all point to Christ. It's a wonderful feature.
Speaking of promoting books, there's a special event coming up in the very near future. If you're enjoying today's conversation and you want to check out this book, there is a book release party. Is that right? An event coming up here in the St. Louis area. Tell us about that.
Well, if you think Organ Vespers is a party, then yes, it certainly is. But
I mean, I do.
I agree. It'll be quite a party, but it will be at Our Redeemer in Overland on September 1st at 3 p.m. So we're calling it Organ Vespers and book release. So I'm going to do Vespers. I'm going to do a short organ recital beforehand, sing some hymns in the context of Vespers, and then I'll do a lecture on my book.
And this is the 21st of September at Our Redeemer?
September 21st at 3 p.m.
Very good. Wow. Well, I bet we could probably provide a link to that in the notes.
I'm sure we can.
Yeah, we can find that and provide a link to it. Our guest today, Benjamin Kolodziej, church organist and musicologist, author of Portraits in American Lutheran Sacred Music, 1847 to 1947, from Concordia Publishing House. Thanks for the conversation today. Looking forward to next time. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@KFUO.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.